The sea doesn't just roar, it screams. At 2:14 local time, the sonar array at the station didn't detect a submarine or a tectonic shift. It detected a heartbeat, a rhythm so slow, so impossibly massive, that it vibrated the very foundations of the ocean floor. Dr. Eris Thorne gripped the edge of his console, his knuckles white against the cold steel. For 20 years, he had been the architect of silence, mapping the abyss, convinced that the deep was a graveyard of cold stone and pressure. He was wrong. It's not a malfunction, he whispered, though his team had already abandoned their stations in a frenzy of confusion. He stared at the monitor, his breath hitching in his throat. The waveform wasn't just noise. It was a sequence, a geometric pulse that mirrored the star charts etched into the monoliths of Giza. His pulse hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the rhythmic thrumming beneath the crust. He felt a sickening, profound vertigo. If this was a machine, it was a machine the size of a mountain. If it was a creature, then every religion, every myth, and every rational scientific theory he had ever championed was nothing more than a bedtime story designed to keep humanity from looking into the dark. The screen flickered. The data stream turned blood red, the numbers cascading into symbols that defied terrestrial logic. He wasn't just observing a discovery. He was witnessing an awakening. Then, the station groaned, a sound of metal twisting like paper. The lights died, plunging the facility into an abyssal blackness, save for one flickering screen. A face, or what passed for a face, manifested in the static. It was ageless, carved from the same material as the stars, and its eyes, voids of infinite depth, locked onto his. The sound returned, louder this time, shaking the station to its core. A voice didn't speak in his ears. It resonated directly within the marrow of his bones.
The cycle is complete.
The floor beneath him vanished. Deep beneath the labyrinthine corridors of the Vatican's secret archives, dust motes danced in the pale, flickering light of a single lantern. Father Julian moved with a heavy, deliberate grace, his fingers trembling as he brushed against spines of leather that hadn't felt the warmth of a human touch in centuries. He was not merely a librarian. He was a custodian of inconvenient truths, a man whose faith had been eroded by the very documents he was sworn to protect. He reached for a codex bound in an unidentified, iridescent material that felt unnaturally cold, like ice forged in the void of space. This was the Codex Aeterna. For years, he had harbored a secret, gnawing fear, that the foundations of the Church were built not upon divine revelation, but upon a desperate, ancient pact with entities that predated the concept of a creator. As he unlatched the heavy silver clasp, the air in the room grew thick, smelling of ozone and ozone-scented storms. The parchment within didn't contain Latin or Greek, but pulsating, shifting geometric patterns that seemed to trace the architecture of reality itself. His heart surged with a dark, intoxicating curiosity, the same vanity that had once tempted the first humans to seek forbidden fruit. He realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, that these pages were not a history book. They were an instruction manual. His eyes scanned a passage describing the reclamation of the celestial anchor. The text spoke of a debt, a promise made by humanity's ancestors to surrender the surface of the world when the stars aligned in a specific, dreaded configuration. The weight of his realization was crushing. His entire life had been a diversion, a carefully crafted lie to keep the world blind to the approaching shadows. A low, rhythmic chanting began to echo from behind the very walls, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated in the deepest, most primal parts of his psyche. He turned, the lantern slipping from his numb fingers. A shadow, darker than the deepest night, detached itself from the stone masonry, its presence radiating a cold, ancient hunger.
You were never meant to finish that sentence, Father.
Julian looked down at the page. The ink had begun to crawl off the parchment, climbing up his own skin like living obsidian. He tried to scream, but the shadows poured into his throat, silencing him forever. As the darkness consumed his vision, the final symbol on the page flared with a blinding, terrifying light. The date of the end, marked for this very night. The world did not end with a cataclysmic blast, but with a synchronized shiver. At precisely the moment the chronometers struck the noon hour of May 22nd, the global grid faltered, not from a surge, but from a command. Across every continent, magnetic north ceased to exist. Compass needles began to spin in frantic, delirious circles, eventually locking into a singular, unwavering trajectory. They pointed upward, toward a patch of empty sky where nothing should have been. In the command center of the Global Monitoring Agency, Elena Vance watched the digital maps turn into chaotic kaleidoscopes of data. A career spent deciphering the language of the Earth had led her to this moment of professional ruin. Her colleagues were shouting over the cacophony of failing alarms, but Elena was silent, paralyzed by the beauty of the catastrophe. She saw the pattern emerging. The shifting magnetic poles weren't a natural deviation. They were a systemic realignment. The planet was being re-indexed.
It's not just the hardware,
She whispered, her voice barely audible over the mechanical hum of the dying servers. She felt the heavy burden of her own intellectual pride. She had spent years searching for signal interference, never considering that the interference might be an intentional broadcast. She realized with a hollow ache that humanity had been living in a curated reality, a fragile bubble of safety that was currently being popped by an ancient needle. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the atmosphere changed. The sky curdled into an impossible shade of violet, and the birds fell silent, as if nature itself were holding its breath.
Elena reached for the emergency satellite override, her hand trembling. As she punched in the final access code, the screens flickered and cleared. They were no longer displaying maps. They were displaying a live feed of the very room she stood in, but filmed from an angle that shouldn't have existed. From a camera hovering just behind her own eyes.
Then, every screen in the facility hummed with a unified, piercing tone, and a single word appeared in ancient, glowing script. Awake. Above her, the ceiling began to dissolve into starlight. Across the globe, the silent sentinels of history, the limestone monoliths of Giza, the weathered ziggurats of Mesopotamia, and the intricate stone tapestries of Angkor Wat, began to breathe. Professor Elias Thorne, a man whose life had been a meticulous obsession with the silent language of stone, stood in the shadow of the Great Pyramid as the very air around him hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled his teeth. He had spent decades deciphering the impossibilities of ancient architecture, often dismissing his own findings as anomalies, terrified of the truth they hinted at. Now, that truth was vibrating beneath his boots. He placed his palm against the rough, sun-warmed blocks. They were not merely carved rock. They were conduits. Beneath his touch, he could feel a rhythmic oscillation, a pulsing hum that matched the frantic cadence of his own heart. He realized with a shattering epiphany that these sites were never tombs or temples. They were colossal, terrestrial tuning forks, dormant for millennia, now vibrating in symphony with a celestial frequency that had finally reached our reach. We were never the architects. He whispered into the encroaching twilight, his voice lost in the rising cacophony of the earth itself. He looked around the plaza. The tourists had long since fled, but the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, unseen presence. The hieroglyphs etched into the surrounding stones began to glow with a faint, iridescent azure hue, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to possess a life of their own. Suddenly, the ground groaned, and the massive capstone of the pyramid shifted. It didn't slide. It dissolved into a shimmering veil of light. As the veil parted, an object rose from the interior, suspended in a defiance of gravity. It was a golden sphere, etched with star maps of galaxies unknown to human telescopes. It projected a beam of pure information directly into the sky. And then, Elias watched in frozen horror as the sky itself cracked, revealing not space, but an infinite, watching eye. The veil between dimensions had worn thin, frayed by the weight of eons. In the silent, frozen wastes of the high Andes, Commander Sarah Miller stood before an ancient aperture. A gateway that defied every law of physics she had spent her military career defending. She was a woman of rigid logic, trained to neutralize threats. Yet here, her training was useless. The threat was not an adversary, but a revelation that rendered her weapons mere toys. She watched as the mountain face itself peeled away, revealing a chamber that seemed to exist in a different state of matter. Within the center stood the Guardians, not of flesh, but of shifting, iridescent geometry. They were the architects of the silence, the jailers of the void, and they had grown weary of their station. Sarah felt a profound, intrusive sorrow emanating from them. It was the grief of beings who had watched civilizations rise and fall like the tide, forever tethered to a duty that had long since lost its purpose.
You seek to hold back the tide,
She whispered, her voice echoing in the chamber of light. She was torn between the desperate, primal urge to protect her world and a burgeoning, forbidden awe. The guardians did not respond with words. They responded with memories. She saw the creation of stars, the cooling of the earth, and the tragic, beautiful realization that humanity was never meant to be the masters of this planet, only its temporary guests. A chilling calm settled over her as the largest of the entities approached. Its form rippled, revealing a reflection of her own face, but older, weathered by 1,000 lifetimes. It gestured toward the gateway, which was now widening, swallowing the horizon. As the structural integrity of the reality she knew began to fracture, a blinding light flooded the chamber. The entity reached out, not to strike, but to offer a hand, and as their fingers touched, the final seal of the gate shattered. Something ancient, vast, and entirely beyond human comprehension began to emerge from the rift. The sky did not fall, it transformed. As the rift widened, the atmosphere shimmered with the brilliance of 1,000 suns, but it brought no heat, only the cold, pristine clarity of forgotten truth. Across the globe, the frantic alarms ceased, replaced by a profound, symphonic resonance. Dr. Eris Thorne, Father Julian, Elena Vance, and Commander Sarah Miller, scattered across continents and realities, each stood still as the veil dissolved. They saw the end of human isolation, not as an arrival of conquerors, but as the return of a long-lost reflection. The entities emerging from the threshold were not gods in the sense of power, but in the sense of memory. They were the architects of our initial spark, returning to reclaim a world that had outgrown its cradle. The fear that had anchored humanity to the dark faded, replaced by the weight of a collective awakening. We were never alone. We were merely waiting for the signal to synchronize with a much larger heartbeat. History is not a linear progression of dates and empires, but a cyclical journey of forgetting and remembering. We have spent centuries looking into the stars, terrified of what we might find, never realizing that we were looking into a mirror. The legends we called myth were simply the echoes of our own ancestors reaching across the expanse of time, trying to remind us that we are woven from the same celestial fabric as the structures we once knelt before. As the old world slipped away, the new one offered a silent, undeniable promise. We have finally taken our place in the symphony of the cosmos. The mystery remains, not in the void, but in the potential of what we will become now that the silence is broken. Remember this. When the stars align, they do not bring judgment. They bring perspective. We are the architects of the next era, and the canvas is finally, beautifully, blank.